Hi. So, in keeping with the subject of the Near East, I've been reflecting on how does this crisis end? It's by far the worst situation the Holy Land has been in modern times, certainly since the creation of Israel in 1948. It's never been this bad. The level of violence, the level of escalation has never reached this point in my lifetime previously, and even if you look at the Yom Kippur War, the Six-Day War, they were costly, but civilian toll wasn't anything like this. So it's an unparalleled situation that region is in modern times. Certainly not in history. I mean, there's millennia of conflict in that part of the world. But it makes me think: is it all a dire situation, or is there any hope at all? And in my view, there's a few things that need to be done for this to end. Now, obviously, I'm no expert. This is just my take on it. And there is multiple approaches. I don't think it's one thing that's going to end this. Firstly, it's very, very obvious that Netanyahu's government is hell bent on eradicating Gaza from the face of the earth. There's no other way to put it. Um, I think his cabinet has some far right people whose vision of this is that Gaza, it has to just be flattened. It has to be absolutely. They just want total eradication. Um, I think they want continued settler expansionism, and they're the antithesis of the sort of vision that Yitzhak Rabin had in 1995. So yeah, I think Netanyahu's government is extreme. Some of the figures around him are even worse than he is. Um, it is important to understand in any country there's internal politics at play, and I think Netanyahu is absolutely pandering to the far right aspects. It's significant that even before the war, this latest escalation began, there was sizable protests against Netanyahu's government. The Quds is a controversial party within Israel, and remember, Israel's a small country, so 100,000 people on the streets of Tel Aviv is a significant portion. The whole country has about 9 million people, so it's a small country. That's why the sort of protests that are going on right now, I don't know what the precise numbers are, but they shouldn't be dismissed. There was footage the other day of an opposition MP being physically removed from the podium, for condemning what's happening in Gaza. That certainly won't be good PR for Israel. Um, so I think if there is an internal pressure for Netanyahu's government to resign, I don't know how that will happen. If there's a forced general election, but Netanyahu will claim that that's impossible at a time of war. But I don't know. I think if his government is somehow removed, that can be a good thing, because if a more moderate government gets in power, if the war in Gaza ends, if this relentless bombing campaign ends, that can only be a good thing. So that's one thing. And with that also comes accountability. Now, I don't believe that Benjamin Netanyahu's ever going to be in prison for what he's done, but at least if he's forced from power, at least there should be some sort of accountability. Recently, Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines was arrested and indicted by the International Criminal Court. He had his supporters, but also lots of Filipinos cheered that because they saw his war on drugs as having a very heavy civilian cost. Lots of people killed in crossfire. So even if Netanyahu never spends a day behind bars, if there is sufficient disgrace within Israel, there may be an avenue for accountability there. I don't know, but I think so long as his government is in power, there's going to be a hawkish approach from Tel Aviv, and that is a problem. On the Palestinian side, Hamas unquestionably is a problem. Now, one of the biggest problems with the pro-Palestinian protests around the world is, despite what they claim, there has unquestionably been sympathies for Hamas. There's unquestionably this correlation with them being freedom fighters. I have a big problem with that because Hamas in the UK is prescribed as a terrorist organization, and I think justifiably so. Hamas deliberately targeted Israeli civilians on October the 7th, not the Israeli army, although there were soldiers killed as well, but they killed civilians in their homes. They burned women and children alive. They kidnapped civilians. Yes, it's happened many times over in Gaza, but two wrongs don't make a right. There's no moral high ground regarding deaths of civilians. Um, there just isn't. There's never a justification for that. So when, young Europeans hold placards celebrating Hamas parachutes and so on, I think that is not only in very bad taste, but it's ignoring the reality that Hamas is much more a part of the problem than the solution. Money that's been channeled into Gaza over the years has been spent on building tunnels. Hamas may deny it, but they do hide behind civilians. All of this only helps Israeli propaganda because some of it, frankly, is true. Um, I still don't think it justifies what Israel's doing. I don't think it, because there's Hamas gunmen in a hospital, that justifies flattening the hospital and killing civilians in the process. But some of Israel's claims are true. I think Hamas does hide behind civilians, um, but it doesn't justify collective punishment. So yeah, I think Hamas is part of the problem. Now they have recently claimed that as part of a deal, they would voluntarily step down in exchange for Israel to allow aid into Gaza and to stop the military campaign. The problem with trusting a terrorist organization is, will they keep their word? But if they did step down, if they released the 58 remaining hostages, it would be a very big step, and it would increase the pressure on Israel to stop, because then Israel could no longer claim that they could no longer make it about the hostages. If Hamas thinks that the hostages are a bargaining chip, they're utterly deluded. Um, if they release the hostages tomorrow, then Netanyahu has no excuses. Um, the problem is, so long as the hostages are there, then they will use that. They'll say they'll release the hostages and the war ends. I don't trust either side. I think Netanyahu's far right government will find an excuse to continue the military campaign, and Hamas won't keep to the word either. But at least it would be a move in the right direction. At least it would put an onus on Netanyahu's government um, to then follow on their end. So Hamas has to be put under pressure to follow through with that. What I would like to see is those who believe in a two-state solution, those who believe in some form of progress to be empowered, but it's very, very difficult, particularly on the Palestinian side. If, it's all very well for outsiders to say, denounce violence and so on, but if you've seen your entire family killed, if you've been under relentless bombardment, if you barely have food to eat, and I've seen propaganda pictures claiming that there's operating bakeries in Gaza. Look, the footage doesn't lie. When you see desperate people clambering around pans and food outlets, they are not acting. There's clearly a crisis on the ground. And this, by the way, is verified by independent sources. Humanitarian groups that are not connected with Hamas have verified that. Doctors, aid workers have testified that the situation on the ground is absolutely appalling. So for Israel and its supporters to claim that it's all fabricated or it's not happening is a callous lie, frankly. It is happening. And it is quite clearly a humanitarian crisis. Um, so that goes without saying. Much, much more aid needs to be let in. What Israel's allowing, this little trickle of aid, just isn't good enough, particularly when you consider how densely populated the Gaza Strip is. As David Lammy pointed out in the comments recently, it's conservative politicians who have called Gaza the world's biggest prison. I think it was David Cameron actually he quoted. It was Margaret Thatcher that put sanctions on Israel after it invaded Lebanon. So this shouldn't necessarily be a partisan issue, it should be a humanitarian issue. Um, but the problem right now is the hardliners in power in Israel and in the Palestinian territories. Um, and so long as they're in power, I don't see a situation where this ends anytime soon because they're actually playing up to their own base. Um, Netanyahu feels he has to prove something to Israeli ultra nationalists, and Hamas feel they have to prove something, presumably to their Iranian backers, or at least in the case of Hezbollah. Um, Iran is definitely a toxic influence on the region. Iran should stay the hell out of it. Arming Hezbollah doesn't help anyone. I think Palestinians whose are against Hamas should be empowered and supported. Um, it would be naive to say there's any quick solution to this, but I am convinced that Israel's military campaign it's not helping to free the hostages, and it's significant that hostages' families are incredibly disillusioned by this. They don't feel it's helping their loved ones. Um, there's other things that can end this. American funding. America is the one country that gives Israel pretty much guaranteed arms support. If the United States cut off that support tomorrow, it would definitely put pressure on Netanyahu's government, because he can afford to retort against the criticism of Carney, Starmer, and Macron. He absurdly claimed they would be judged by history. No, it's him that will be judged by history, but he can afford to do that because it's minuscule support to begin with. The real issue is American support. Now, Donald Trump is highly unlikely to cut off arms support for Israel, even though he's had frustrations with Netanyahu on a personal basis. But actually, even if Harris was president, she probably wouldn't either, because the pro Israel lobby in the United States is extremely influential. That isn't a conspiracy theory, it's a reality. Um, American support for Israel is unquestionably a major backing for this. Now, regarding my monetization, if YouTube looks at this, I'm not coming out with conspiracy theories because there are Jewish groups who are very anti what Israel is doing right now. In fact, some of the most vocal groups are groups like the Jewish Voice for Peace. I have enormous respect for them because they can hardly be accused of being pro Hamas. They're hardly going to support a group that is anti Jewish as well as anti Israel. Um, but they are absolutely against what the Israeli government's doing right now. Um, like I say, this is a complex situation. There's no quick solution, but all those things would help. The American support for Israel, if that was to be cut off, it would put pressure on the Israeli government to stop the military campaign. But Hezbollah and Hamas firing rockets into Israel is not, that isn't helping anyone. It's really not. And what Hamas done on October the 7th was not an act of resistance. It was an act of stunning stupidity. But like I say, maybe they don't care because top Hamas commanders are living you know, in Qatar and other places. They're not the ones suffering. It's Palestinian civilians who are suffering. That's why I get angry with people who support them because they really aren't helping their own people. They're not helping the Palestinians. I suppose you could argue that a young man or even a young woman in Gaza who's seen their entire family killed is more likely to be radicalized and join Hamas. That's a no-brainer. Um, so actually, arguably, what Israel's doing is a recruiting tool for Hamas. I would argue much more so than Western governments criticizing Israel's actions. Um, the collective punishment of Palestinians is actually a recruiting tool for Hamas, ironically. So that's how I see it. People are free to disagree, but there may be other things that I'm overlooking. There probably is. I've mentioned the hostages. It's worth mentioning that there are many more Palestinians held in Israeli jails, many of them minors, many of them without due process. So they are arguably hostages as well. And one of the biggest problems with this conflict is the perception of double standards, the perception that Israeli lives are deemed to be more valuable than Palestinian lives. I think that is one of the deepest sources of animosity um, towards Western backers and also towards Israel. But at the same time, it can't be denied that Hamas has an explicitly genocidal manifesto towards Israel. That isn't going to solve anything. Because if Israel feels its very existence is threatened, of course it's going to lash out. If they justify that our very existence is threatened, we have no choice, they're going to do that. I still think it's wrong. I still think Netanyahu's government's gone too far. Um, yes, there is a legitimate right to self-defense, but talking about eradicating Gaza and in the future building real estate in Gaza, that's not self defense. It's ethnic cleansing of the worst kind. I think use of the Iron Dome, I think taking out Hamas commanders is legitimate. I don't think relentlessly bombing Palestinian civilians, bombing hospitals, denying aid, I don't think that's legitimate at all. Anyway, it's a horrible situation. I just hope somehow this can de-escalate. Somehow the violence ends. Aid can be allowed into Gaza, and there could be those who have goodwill, those who believe in a two-state solution, somehow want to get back into power. Right now, that's a distant concept because it's the hardliners in power. But like I say, so long as they're in power on either side, um, both frankly have genocidal intentions. It's yeah, when I'm monetizing this, I'm gonna have to select controversial subjects, but I'm not showing any explicit content. I'm not using profanities. So we'll see what happens. But it's a very important issue. Let me know your thoughts.